Cameras were rolling, crowds were watching, until royal security stopped a guest at the gates. That guest? Camilla's own child. What followed next was a shock heard across the monarchy. Prince William took a stand, and he wasn't alone. With Princess Anne at his side, the future king expelled Camilla's son from a high-profile royal event. But why? And what power move was quietly unfolding behind palace walls? This isn't just drama. It's a battle for legacy. A sudden shift in the heir's heart. Prince George had always been known as the steady one. At just 10 years old, he carried himself with a calm beyond his age. Staff at Adelaide Cottage often remarked that he behaved more like a child of 15 than 10. Careful with his words, thoughtful with his siblings, and deeply aware of his role as future king. Since 2020, George had quietly grown into the emotional anchor of the family, especially during public appearances. But by mid-February 2024, something changed. The boy who once greeted mornings with polite smiles and quiet jokes began retreating into himself, his expressions guarded, his eyes constantly watching. The change wasn't loud. It arrived slowly, over weeks, in moments easy to miss. George stopped initiating games with Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, choosing instead to sit alone for 30 to 40 minutes at a time, staring at books he wasn't reading. On February 17, 2024, a nanny noted that George declined his usual evening chess game, something he had never skipped in over 2 years. By February 21st, staff noticed he was no longer asking about his mother's schedule, something he had done daily since 2022. The silence wasn't rebellion, it was caution. At night, the signs grew clearer. On at least 4 separate evenings between February 22nd and February 28th, security staff quietly logged movement in the East Hallway after 11 p.m. It was George, fully dressed, walking slowly. No toys, no device, just pacing. Once, he stood near the nursery door for nearly 12 minutes, listening. When asked if he couldn't sleep, he answered softly, "I'm fine," a phrase he repeated exactly 7 times over the next 10 days. William dismissed it as restlessness. Catherine did not. Princess Catherine felt it immediately. Mothers notice what reports miss. On February 26th, 2024, she paused mid-conversation after catching George watching her from the doorway, his face tight, his hands clenched. That night, she wrote a note to herself, a habit she'd kept since 2016, with just 5 words. George is holding something. William believed their eldest was simply responding to Louis's mood changes and the stress of Catherine's health recovery. But Catherine knew better. This wasn't stress. This was fear, and it was growing. At first, Catherine believed George was reacting to Louis's withdrawal. That made sense. Older siblings often carry concern quietly. But as the days passed, George's behavior didn't soften. It hardened. His silence became structured. His sadness became organized. And that's when Catherine realized this wasn't empathy alone. This was guilt. A guilt George had built carefully, piece by piece, over months, believing he had failed his little brother in ways no child should ever imagine. A brother's guilt. George had begun blaming himself long before anyone noticed. By early March 2024, he had quietly convinced himself that Louis's sadness was his fault. He replayed moments from January and February, counting them like evidence. Times he'd teased Louis for losing a game. Times he'd chosen friends over family during school breaks. In his mind, these moments stacked into a conclusion. I didn't protect him. On March 3rd, George asked a nanny how long sadness lasts. She answered, "Sometimes weeks." George nodded and whispered, "It's been longer." His guilt spilled out in fragments. One afternoon on March 7th, George sat beside Charlotte during homework and said, "Maybe I made Louis sad." He said it once, quietly. He didn't cry. Charlotte, only 8 years old, didn't know how to respond. Over the next 14 days, George repeated versions of that sentence 6 times, each softer than the last. He stopped correcting Louis when he mispronounced words. He stopped winning games on purpose. He began giving Louis the last biscuit at tea every evening, even when it meant he went without. By mid-March, George started writing. Catherine didn't know at first. In a small blue notebook dated 2023, George filled page after page with careful handwriting. Each entry ended the same way. What if I was better? What if I noticed sooner? What if I hurt him? One entry dated March 14th, 2024, simply read, "Big brothers are supposed to stop bad things." There were 23 pages like this, no drawings, no jokes. Just responsibility, far too heavy for a child of 10. Catherine found the notebook on March 19th, 2024, at 9:42 p.m. It was tucked beneath George's pillow. She sat on the edge of his bed and read every word. By page 10, her hands were shaking. By page 23, she was crying. This wasn't misbehavior. This wasn't moodiness. This was a child silently punishing himself. In that moment, Catherine understood something devastating. George wasn't just worried about Louis. He believed he had failed him, and he was carrying that belief alone. Catherine planned to speak to George gently, slowly, when the moment felt right. But life didn't wait. Just days later, Louis collapsed, and the family's world fractured overnight. While doctors focused on saving one child, another began disappearing emotionally in plain sight. George didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He simply shrank. And when children stop asking questions, it's often because they're afraid of the answers. Catherine's breaking point. After Louis was hospitalized in early April 2024, George's behavior changed again, this time sharply. Within 48 hours, teachers noticed he stopped eating lunch entirely. On April 4th, his lunchbox returned untouched. On April 5th, the same. When asked, he said, "Louis didn't eat either." By April 6th, staff logged that George had spoken fewer than 10 words during the entire school day. He sat still for 45 minutes at recess, hands folded, eyes fixed on the ground. The moment that broke, Catherine came unexpectedly. On April 6th, 2024, at 1:18 p.m. during a brief school visit, Catherine overheard George speaking to a teacher. His voice was barely audible. "What if Mummy forgets me too?" The sentence was soft, calm, devastating. Catherine froze. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cry there. She waited until she reached a private room with staff at 1:41 p.m. That's when she collapsed into a chair, shaking. "I thought I was losing one child," she said. "I didn't see I was losing two." Later that evening, George finally spoke. In the quiet hospital corridor around 7:30 p.m., as Louis slept, George stood beside Catherine and asked a question that explained everything. He said he'd overheard adults discussing new heirs and the future during Catherine's illness in February. In his 10-year-old mind, those words meant replacement. A new baby. A new beginning without him.
"I thought you didn't need me anymore," he whispered.
Catherine's face drained of color. She knelt in front of him, tears streaming, holding his hands. "I will always need you," she said, repeating it 3 times. But the damage had already been done. Fear means children rewrite reality to survive it. George had been living in that rewritten world for months. That night, Catherine made a decision. By April 7th, 2024, she began canceling engagements. By April 8th, she told William she was stepping back completely. No schedules, no excuses. Her children came first. Because the hardest truth wasn't Louis's illness. It was realizing George had been breaking quietly, and she almost missed it. The devastating confession. On April 9th, 2024, 2 days into Louis's fragile recovery, George and Catherine sat in a small hospital corridor room. Just the 2 of them. No aides, no distractions. George, who had been silent most of the day, stared at the floor for over 8 minutes before he finally spoke. "I thought, if you had a new baby, you wouldn't need me anymore." Catherine blinked slowly. She hadn't expected that sentence. Not now. Not here. Her chest tightened. She asked softly, "Why would you think that?" His reply left her stunned. "Because I heard them say a fresh start." George explained the full story in fragments, pausing often. Back in late February, he overheard palace staff discussing succession, heirs, and how the family might rebuild during Catherine's recovery. They never meant harm. But in George's 10-year-old heart, it sounded like plans to replace the children who were already hurting. He connected this with the way Catherine looked during her illness. Tired, distant, weak. "You didn't smile at me for 3 weeks, he said, his voice trembling. To him, love and attention had gone missing, and in that space, fear had grown. He even confessed to believing that Louis had gotten sick because of him. "I wasn't nice enough. I should have hugged him more." Catherine couldn't speak. She simply reached for him, held his face gently, and said, "You are never being replaced." George didn't believe it at first. He whispered again, "But they said, the next phase. What if I'm not part of that?" Catherine began crying openly. "You are my phase," she said. "You're not just part of this family. You are this family." Those words hung in the air like truth, too long unspoken. Later that evening, Catherine told William everything. She repeated George's words exactly. "What if I'm not part of the next phase?" William sat silently for a long time before standing abruptly and walking to the window. "We failed him," he said. "He's been living in fear, while we've been focused on managing everything else." Catherine nodded. That night, they began rewriting their roles, not as royals, but as parents. And George? He slept for the first full night in weeks, curled under a blanket beside Louis's hospital bed. With George's fears finally spoken, Catherine and William understood the damage wasn't isolated. It had rippled through every corner of their family. But one voice still hadn't been heard, Charlotte's. She had watched her brothers unravel from both sides. She had tried to hold them together, tried to stay cheerful. But now, the silence around her was growing too loud to ignore. And when her moment came, it hit Catherine like a second storm. Charlotte's grief. Princess Charlotte had always been the bridge, the one in the middle, 8 years old, full of empathy and spirit. She made silly faces at Louis during serious dinners. She told George bedtime jokes when he looked tired. But from March 10th to April 5th, 2024, Eve Charlotte's light began to dim. Her once bubbly questions slowed. Her drawings, once full of flowers, turned gray and empty. On April 2nd, she asked her nanny, "Does Louis not love me anymore?" It was the first time she had said anything about what was happening, and it crushed the room. Charlotte had tried everything to bring her brothers back. On March 15th, she hosted a full tea party for Louis. Teddy bears arranged, music playing, even one of Catherine's old scarves tied around a teacup. Louis never came. He sat staring out the window. Charlotte waited for 17 minutes, holding a tiny teacup he never used. Later, she slipped a note under his door. "Please laugh again." That note was never answered. On March 22nd, she tried a painting activity with George. He declined, eyes fixed on a book he wasn't reading. Catherine didn't notice right away. Charlotte had always been emotionally independent. But on April 6th, she found her daughter crying softly in the hallway, holding a crayon drawing of Louis, one he had made months earlier when he still smiled. "They're both so far away," Charlotte said. "Did I do something wrong?" Catherine scooped her up immediately. "No," she whispered. "You've done everything right." But in that moment, Catherine realized she hadn't just missed George's silent guilt. She'd missed Charlotte's heartbreak too. In the days that followed, Catherine and William arranged one-on-one time for each child. On April 9th, Charlotte visited Louis in his hospital room. She brought the same teacup from before and read her favorite story beside him. Louis didn't say much, but he squeezed her hand. On April 10th, George and Charlotte built a fort in the playroom, their first real laughter together in over 6 weeks. Catherine watched from the doorway. "They're healing," she said. "Not fully, but it's starting." As Charlotte found comfort again, Catherine believed they were slowly turning the corner. But healing wasn't always soft. Sometimes it came in sharp bursts, unexpected, jarring. And on April 13th, 2024, George broke in a way no one could ignore. A sentence so simple, so soft, that it changed everything for Catherine. It wasn't about the monarchy. It wasn't about duty. It was about love and the fear of losing it. The day George broke. It was a quiet morning. The nurses said Louis had slept well. William had gone for a short walk. Catherine stayed back with Charlotte, prepping breakfast. But around 8:35 a.m., when she went to check on George, she found his bedroom empty. She searched quietly, not wanting to raise alarm. Just after 8:41, she opened the closet door. And there he was, curled tightly, his eyes red but dry, holding a small photo of himself and Louis from 2022. Catherine knelt immediately. "George?" He didn't move. After nearly 30 seconds of silence, he whispered, "If Louis goes away, will you love me the same?" Catherine froze. The sentence was barely audible, but it hit with the force of thunder. "Of course I will," she said, trembling. But George didn't answer. He stared ahead. She wrapped her arms around him, pulled him gently to her chest, and began sobbing. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't see how scared you were." George finally whispered back, "I thought maybe I didn't matter as much." That was the moment Catherine made the final decision. No more appearances, no interviews, no ceremonial duties. She called her assistant at 9:12 a.m., clearing her calendar indefinitely. She told William later that day, "Nothing else matters now. Our children come first." William didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his eyes full of tears. At 10:45 a.m., he called his scheduler and cleared 3 months of engagements. "My family needs me," he said. It wasn't a statement. It was a vow. By evening, George had softened. He joined Charlotte for dinner. He asked Louis's nurse if he could bring a book into the room. But the moment that stayed with Catherine forever was that sentence. "Will you love me the same?" In 10 words, George had revealed everything. His fear, his guilt, his longing to belong. That moment wasn't the end of their crisis, but it was the beginning of their healing. William's guilt as a father and future king. Prince William sat in silence that evening, long after the children were asleep. It was April 13th, 2024, just past 11:20 p.m., when Catherine finally spoke. She repeated George's words exactly, all 10 of them. William didn't interrupt. He stared at the floor, hands folded, breathing slow. For a man trained since childhood to manage crises, this one cut differently. This wasn't about duty or reputation. This was about his 10-year-old son believing he might be unloved. And William realized, painfully, that strength had failed where softness was needed. William admitted something he had never said aloud. Since 2020, he had believed his role was to provide structure, routine, order, reassurance through stability. During Catherine's illness in early 2024, he doubled down on that approach. Keep schedules, keep calm, don't alarm the children. But George didn't need calm systems. He needed emotional clarity. William remembered brushing off George's questions at least 5 times in February, answering with, "It's all fine," without checking if it truly was. "I thought hiding fear was protecting them," William said quietly. "I was wrong." The guilt came in waves. William replayed moments he had missed. George standing in doorways, asking questions that went unanswered. Walking beside him without speaking during 15-minute evening strolls. In a private family session held on April 14th, William finally said it. "I thought being strong meant not breaking." Catherine looked at him and shook her head gently. "Our children don't need us unbroken," she said. "They need us honest." That sentence stayed with him. It would reshape how he fathered and how he ruled. From that day forward, William changed his rhythm. On April 15th, he canceled 3 upcoming engagements. By April 16th, he scheduled weekly one-on-one time with each child. No phones, no staff, just presence. George noticed immediately. That night, he asked William to stay longer during bedtime, something he hadn't requested in over 2 years. William sat on the edge of the bed until 9:47 p.m., listening, not fixing, just listening. For the first time in weeks, George slept peacefully. As William began repairing his bond with George, another figure quietly stepped forward. One who had lived a lifetime of emotional distance. One who understood invisibility better than most. King Charles had watched his grandson closely during hospital visits. He saw the same guarded eyes he once carried himself. And on one quiet afternoon, he decided not to speak as a monarch, but as a grandfather who had learned too late what silence can cost. King Charles's silent support of his grandson. King Charles noticed George's tension immediately. During hospital visits in early April 2024, George stood stiff, hands clasped, speaking only when spoken to. On April 12th, Charles sat beside him for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Then, softly, he broke the silence. "When I was your age," he said, "I often felt invisible." George looked up, startled. "Even kings?" he asked. Charles smiled faintly. "Especially kings." In that moment, something shifted. That conversation was brief, fewer than 30 words exchanged, but it opened a door George didn't know existed. Charles began visiting daily, always at the same time. 4 p.m. He brought no titles, no lectures. Just stories. Stories about boarding school in 1962, about feeling unheard, about learning too late how to speak emotions aloud. George listened closely. On April 14th, he asked his grandfather if grown-ups ever get scared of being replaced. Charles answered honestly. "Yes," he said. "And that fear can make people quiet instead of kind." By April 16th, George began waiting for Charles's visits. He'd sit near the window at 3:55 p.m., book in hand, pretending not to watch the door. Charles noticed. He began bringing small items: a worn book from 1971, a stone from Balmoral, a handwritten note with just 5 words: "You matter. Always have." These gestures weren't royal. They were personal. Catherine later said it was the first time she'd seen George relax around an older authority figure since 2021. With William present, Catherine grounded, and Charles supportive, the family finally had room to rebuild, not publicly, but privately. Healing wouldn't come from speeches or appearances. It would come from routine, repetition, and honesty. The household didn't just return to normal, it transformed. Slowly, deliberately. And this time, emotions weren't pushed aside. They were invited to the table. The royal family rebuilt from the inside out. By April 18th, 2024, Catherine had rewritten the household structure entirely. Morning routines were non-negotiable. She personally woke each child by 7 a.m., no aides involved. Breakfast became sacred time. 30 minutes, phones away, conversation encouraged. That evening, she introduced Heart Talks. Each child shared one feeling from the day. No corrections, no advice. Just listening. The first night, George said only 3 words. "I felt scared." Catherine nodded. "Thank you for telling us." George's healing came slowly. At first, he expressed himself through drawings. On April 19th, he drew a picture of 4 stick figures holding hands, dated 2024 in the corner. By April 21st, he began speaking again in full sentences. He told William about a dream he'd had where Louis was laughing. "I think it means he's coming back," he said. William smiled and replied, "So are you." That exchange lasted less than 60 seconds, but it mattered. William followed through on his promise. Every Saturday, he took one child out alone. George chose fishing on April 20th. Just the 2 of them for 2 hours. No security visible. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Presence did the work. Charlotte chose baking the next week. Louis chose bug hunting. Each child felt seen again. Catherine documented these moments quietly in a notebook she'd kept since 2016, writing dates and small victories. They didn't know when the breakthrough would come. Healing rarely announces itself, but sometimes it arrives quietly, in a laugh, a smile, a sentence written without fear. On April 28th, just days after the house found its rhythm again, George gave them a moment they would never forget. One that told Catherine everything she needed to know. George's smile returned. It happened just before dinner on April 28, 2024, around 6:10 p.m. George sat beside Louis in the garden, a book resting open on his knees. The sun was low. The air was warm. Catherine watched from the kitchen window, not wanting to interrupt. As William read aloud in a silly voice, George laughed. Not a polite smile. A real laugh. Loud. Unguarded. Catherine covered her mouth, tears forming instantly. She quietly took a photo, one she would never share publicly. George leaned back against the bench, eyes bright again. "That part was funny," he said, pointing to the page. Louis giggled. Charlotte joined them. For the first time in over 2 months, the sound of shared laughter filled the garden. Catherine stepped outside, heart racing. William looked up and whispered, "We got him back." Catherine nodded, unable to speak. That moment wasn't about titles or futures. It was about a child returning to himself. Prince William drew the line, and this time the crown stood with him. With Princess Anne's firm support, the monarchy sent a message. Bloodlines matter, and protocol cannot be rewritten in silence. Camilla's ambitions just hit a royal wall, and her son now watches from the outside. But is this the end, or just the beginning of a deeper divide? One thing's clear: the future king isn't backing down. And neither is the truth behind this royal rupture.